Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's panel discussion, how cybersecurity solutions can help protect patients at scale. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Saif Abed from the Abed Graham Group over there in London, along with Chuck Scheller, who spent 18 plus years in a leading US health organization over there in Boston, and CyPass CEO Adil Khan, who's in Dallas today. So a big warm welcome to you all. We'll start off with a brief introduction so that our attendees can get to know you a little better before we dive into today's discussion. So Saif, if you'd like to start off.
Sure. So my name is Dr. Saif Abed. I'm a physician by background based in London, England. But for the past decade, I have been a partner and director of cybersecurity services at the Abed Graham Group, which is a global technology and advisory services firm focusing on security and risk in healthcare, where 90% of the staff are clinical by background, physicians and nurses. And we do a lot of work from national security, national level work through to local healthcare provider work. Outside of that, I'm also an independent expert advisor on healthcare security for the European Commission. I'm part of the roster of experts for digital health for the World Health Organization, and I'm a high-risk subject matter expert for the UK government's Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And I also have a research focus on the impact of cyber warfare on national critical infrastructure, especially healthcare. I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks, Saif. Chuck?
Hi, my name is Chuck Scheller. I'm a business systems professional who I've spent a good number of years, at least 18 or more, with an entity in the New England area dealing with and improving their application suite, focusing from financial management into customer relationship management, but also pertinent to the topics today, a good 10 years or more working with the likes of Oracle in their GRC product, as well as experiences with Adil and others, getting the whole focus on what's needed to ensure security to the applications and to the overall business needs as well. With that, I spent a good amount of time, having come from the finance side of the business, bringing that to the attention with the various players. So we had a good balanced opportunity, and I'll talk further relative to some of the specifics of what we accomplished. At this point, I'll turn it to Adil.
Okay, thanks, and welcome, Chuck and Saif, and I appreciate you guys contributing your thought leadership to our users and customers. This is our way of educating the market, and obviously healthcare is on our minds as our fellow citizens and colleagues are going through these difficult times, are fighting this pandemic. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you for joining today's session with us, but also wanted to let people know that we are in partnership, developing and growing our partnerships in this area with experts like Saif and the Saif Abed Graham Group, as well as with Chuck as our independent expert in this field. So if you have any specific deep dive around the healthcare risks, today is just going to be a little bit of an introduction of what we're seeing and what these experts are seeing as thought leaders. But also, if you want to take a deeper dive, reach out to us, and we'll be glad to give you the specifics around your pain points in this very important market that is unfortunately, going through some challenges, both from patient care, clinical care, as well as from cyber risks that we'll talk about in a minute. My background as CEO of CyPass, I'm here responsible for taking care of our customer needs. Primarily, we're fortunate to have a great team in place to help customers detect, remediate, prevent risk across their enterprise systems, including healthcare industry. So we service 10 or 11 total industries around the world with 250 some customers. I've been talking about this topic for 15 plus years I've written a book on this topic called Governance Risk and Compliance Handbook for Oracle, and we look forward to sharing our experiences with you on this in this session today. I'll give a quick background, Emma, on our company, who we are. Most of you know us. We have been in this industry for many years, where we have helped customers like Chuck's organization, where he worked, address their risks, specifically around digital transformation and digital type risks in their enterprise systems. So those business critical applications. And that's what Gartner has recognized as one of the most complete solutions to help customers identify risk. All the major audit firms are aware of who we are, and many times when they audit their clients, they leverage our applications and tools to determine the level of control effectiveness in the digital systems. And as a result of that, we spend a lot of time in talking to and educating the customers and auditors about what's the latest and greatest in managing risk. We're excited about being honored to be presenting at the Oracle User Conference, and also their white paper. They've asked us to contribute an article in their fall edition. So stay tuned for more content and information about the changing profile of risk and emerging profile of risk as a result of the current environment we're in. With that, I'd like, Seth, for you to say a few things about the Abbott Group.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the Abed Graham Group's been around for a decade. And what's interesting about us is that our leadership are all clinicians by background, and the consultants in the firm are clinicians by background. And we've worked advising some of the largest enterprise software and systems integrators in the world as they address healthcare projects, whether, as I mentioned before, they're specific to local hospitals, wherever they may be, or they're at the national security level, national critical infrastructure when it comes to healthcare. We've been very fortunate to be involved in bringing a clinical perspective, a clinical risk viewpoint to many projects around the world. And that's exposed us to work even outside of healthcare organizations and big technology companies into government agencies. As I mentioned, that's allowed me to become known to an extent so that I can be an independent expert to a range of other organizations. But over the last couple of years, we've extended our capabilities and developed our own analytics platform that we call CCOM Squared, which actually stands for Clinical Cyber Outcomes Model. And essentially, that is a platform that receives vulnerability and asset data from technical security solutions and translates them and ranks them based on their potential impact to patient safety and the disruption of clinical services. That's in itself a solution that was a decade in development based on the mapping of clinical workflows in different settings, their interactions, the way endpoints can behave in those different clinical workflows. It's a really a lifetime's work in many ways, or at least a career's worth of work. And we're very fortunate to have that being integrated under the covers of an increasing number of security solutions that are being taken into healthcare today. So it's an exciting time at the Abed Graham Group.
Fantastic.
Yes, thanks for that, Saif. So at SafePath, we always like to start off with some statistics to set the scene, so to speak. So if you'd like to pass to the next slide, Adil. Thank you. So here, as you can see, the big picture. So why are we here talking about what we are talking about today? So who'd like to jump in and start off the discussion with the statistics that you can see there on the screen as our talking point?
Yeah, I don't mind kind of just jumping in quickly there. I think one of the interesting points around healthcare, and I've seen this in every country, I do a lot of work in the United States now, but even, especially in Europe, there's a big mismatch between digital maturity and security maturity. You're seeing a lot of investment in digital transformation driven by government policies initially to go paperless or paper light. But that's introduced new risks, and it hasn't had a compensating level of investment in security at the same time. So we've seen this increase in digital maturity without security keeping pace, and that gap between those two has made healthcare a really attractive target. And these stats that you put up on the slide kind of illustrate attackers recognizing that and exploiting it.
I think to jump in as well, organization that I had worked with for many years, really started at the beginning with its security group, looking at and putting a framework of questions together as a survey to ensure that organizations that were interested in connecting or doing business with them went through a fairly elaborate and specific survey to ensure that each organization, as well as the core company, understood what was at play and who would be asking for what credentials to engage in business activities with them. So having that framework together opened the dialogue in gaining an understanding to be able to keep ahead of the curve here relative to any breaches.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, actually, just because we look at the landscape digitally now, especially in light of the pandemic, accelerating things such as telemedicine and data sharing between multiple organizations that otherwise might not have shared clinical data as often. Really understanding that landscape and knowing who's doing what with which business and the credentials underpinning that is so important, isn't it?
Very much so.
Absolutely, and I'd like to. Yeah, Chuck, that's a good point. And Saf, thanks for bringing that up. So being the technology guy in this panel, one of the things that our customers in the healthcare are looking for is better visibility into third-party risks. So supply chains are under significant pressure right now. So traditionally, we look at financial controls risk, but financial controls are really dependent on, the strength of the rest of the operations, right? So what feeds into finance comes from procure to pay cycle, order to cash cycle, and so forth. So we're seeing those operational processes under significant strain right now in this segment. Specifically, I wanted to call out the third-party risks because you're forced to deal with suppliers that you may have never done business with, and that's causing some spike in the risk. There's stories beyond what we have on the screen here, where healthcare organizations have placed orders for very important PPE equipment, where it was not delivered or not quality and so forth. So third-party risk in healthcare has really bubbled up among our customers that we look after to help them protect their businesses. And we're putting in some monitoring control, which I'll talk about at the end, to help them improve the supply chain, specifically around their procurement processes and onboarding new suppliers and so forth. So yeah, it's clear from these stats when we look at them that the risk is growing, and it's been in place, even years ago, like back in 2016. You're looking at the cost. So in most cases, it's not a question of business justification, which is something as a technology guy we all have to go and explain to our potential buyers is, what is the ROI in the solution? In this case, it's not about the ROI. It's about the completeness and accuracy of what we can do to help improve, like I said, the supply chain and other risks for our customers. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into it. So thanks for that commentary.
Yes, and moving on. So how can we define risk in the healthcare industry specifically? So based on, your experiences in the field, your own research, your opinion, how would you define risk in the healthcare industry?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. When I was still practicing medicine and looking at doing this career transition, forming Abed Graham, one of the big parts of it was that it felt like to that point in kind of 2005, 2010, as I was thinking about that, it seemed like risk was very much in a technical silo. There wasn't really any commentary on clinical risk. Patient safety still was something that was seen more of as it was, a safety and care quality issue. It didn't really enter the realm of what CIOs and other more technical leaders were talking about then. And so for me, clinical risk is what what a lot of it comes down to or seeds from, because healthcare is the business of delivering the best care at the right time, at the right place, as needed, to give the best outcomes to patients. So for me, there's a big lens on clinical risk as a viewpoint and an anchor to all the other elements of risk, and they all contribute to that in return. But that's certainly coming from a biased perspective, given my background.
From a business perspective, clearly I look at, and one of the thoughts that really drove me over the years was, where's the data coming from? What's important? What's in these numbers? Are these numbers believable? Can we get back to the true source, to ensure that decisions that are being made, whether it's on the clinical side or financial side, we've got the data necessary to ensure that appropriate decisions and directives are being made. So, I see in the role that I played, being in the crossroads of both business and technical, as well as clinical, having had some experiences in clinical research myself, being able to put that puzzle together and ensure that the pieces fit.
Yeah, so I think I'll build on, Chuck, what you and Saf have just said. I mean, we are obviously data-driven at SafePass, so we collect information, but one of the things we have to be very careful about is, the purpose of that information. I think GDPR, for example, in Europe is way ahead of where we are here in the US at this point, other than the state you live in, Chuck, as well as California has passed some strong guidelines and principles. So I think to us, when we look at healthcare risks as a data company that's helping customers control those risks, we look at where's the data, who needs that access, what are they going to do with that data, are they going to share that with third parties? I talked a minute ago about the supply chain. So we're starting to see where not just third-party risk, but fourth-party risk. So for example, if your provider is putting data in AWS, what is AWS doing with that data, right? So it's becoming the need to have the protection around healthcare information, as you said, Chuck, from a source of truth perspective, as well as from a clinical perspective, as Abbott Graham's well known in the market for. I think if you look at all those sources of data, we call them data sources, and coalesce them together in a way to form insight around risk, I think that's the value, the quantitative value that we can bring to the healthcare industry that may be missing right now, or as we said earlier, might be siloed, because if those dots don't connect, you sometimes miss the big picture.
Yes, thanks for those great comments there. And moving on to Saif, if you'd like to talk us through this slide here, the risks that the health organizations face.
Yeah, I mean, this is really pivotal to all the work we do at the Abbott Graham Group, is having a thematic approach to how you assess both risks and benefits. And whether it's in our advisory work or the themes that we do in our kind of real-time analytics, they all come down to this. And we call it the COFR approach. Pronunciations don't matter, but that's what we call it. And essentially, it's just the first letter of each of these four themes. So to us, when you assess a risk, the first heading is clinical risk, and that's the risk to individual patient safety of, for example, a vulnerability being exploited, or a threat being detected that corresponds to a vulnerability in your network, or some kind of behavior that's considered aberrant with a health system. The next level is organizational risk, and that's about scale. So if we stick with the notion of a vulnerability being exploited, what kind of disruption can it cause to clinical and operational services at scale throughout an individual organization, or even catalyzed to neighboring organizations? A lot of our work is focused on health systems, not just individual hospitals, so that's a big element of it. And then based on the clinical and combined organizational risk, you can derive from that viewpoints or scales in terms of financial and regulatory and reputational risk. Because we've done a lot of research where we've effectively seen that the use cases that have had an attack or some kind of cyber event occur, where the event was seeded in a disruption of clinical services or could be linked to some form of potential patient harm or a sense of clinical urgency, tend to end up on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of their recovery costs within a 12-month period after that. So by anchoring in a viewpoint of clinical and organizational risk, we can derive further metrics in terms of the potential severity in terms of financial recovery, but also the regulatory scrutiny that an organization or its leadership team may face. So that's kind of the thematic approach that we take, and we find that it's been very simple but very effective over the years that we've used it.
I think also to add to the conversation here, one of the focus points that with my background, the financial risk was one of the key areas that I had to take a look at in making sure that really who's coming into the organization through our applications, what do they have access to, what changes might they be able to make. But to sort of lay the framework out, it required a partnership with our finance group, other groups within the organization to ensure we could hone in on, what are the key controls to have a look at and to monitor. So we'll get into more of that conversation later in today's presentation. But clearly, to be a going concern, you need to make sure that you do have a handle on and understanding risks. And again, for me, the focus that I brought to the group was primarily in the financial area.
I just want to make a quick point. I think what's really important about this, and even with this thematic framework, is that it ensures that you have the right mix of stakeholders in the room talking about risk, right? At the end of the day, if I'm a leader in a hospital and Chuck, you're a leader in a hospital, we should be sitting in the same room talking about risk. And this is one way of making sure we find some kind of common language to do that.
That's correct. It's the sustainability is key for that kind of commitment and understanding, especially at that level.
Yeah, and I'll take a different perspective on that. So I think you guys have laid out what the risk is at a very holistic level. Obviously, this all leads to reputational risk. No hospital or a clinic wants to be in the paper saying that they lost patient records or had a supply chain issue that cost them more damage. So when I'm in the trenches working with our clients, this is exactly the problem that I see that Chuck, you and Saf just brought up, where it's very siloed, right? We use the word silo throughout this presentation, I guess, today, because that's exactly what's happening when you meet with the CFO office at let's say a medical school where I have a recent example of working with. You find that CFO is very focused on the financial statement risk to make sure that the reporting they're doing to the federal agencies here in the US, national agencies, that gets them the right level of funding and grants and so forth that they need. So that's on the financial risk side. Then you go talk to the folks that are inside the medical school. They're concerned about treatment of the patients and so forth. And so it's not a uniform objective. And what happens is that it creates a quote unquote an audit fatigue in the organization. Some controls are part of all of these different silos, so they're getting over tested. Others are possibly ignored because one group thinks the other group must be handling it. So I think having that collaboration and getting those folks in on a common platform, which today is a digital platform. We don't have the luxury of that conference room, at least in the short term. So I think having that digital platform where you can really, slice and dice your risk, identify the controls that mitigate that risk, and go down to that top-down risk-based approach that ultimately keeps you out of the news and protects your bottom line at the same time. you've got to be able to create that collaboration across these elements. The challenges, of course, like I said, we're not face to face, so we may be even more fragmented right now, which is increasing the exposure to the healthcare organizations.
Thanks for that, Adil. So moving on to the next slide, let's talk about some of the top risks that healthcare organizations face. So as you can see here, we have some of the challenges that healthcare institutions, providers, vendors face. So Chuck, if you'd like to take a couple of them and walk us through why you think they're top risks for healthcare organizations.
Sure. I think right from the beginning, when you first look at budgetary constraints, you really need to understand, what's the real ROI or need for that data or information. For some of the points Adil was just mentioning in terms of reputation-wise, you really need to then find the money to make sure that certain key work is done to achieve the goals of the organization. And another area that I'll speak to, again, goes back to identity governance and looking at segregation of duties. With COVID ID and various things that have put businesses into a let's reconsider because of reductions of staff, other things that have been going on, who can now take the place of what might have been several staff into one person, but also be able to measure, understand, again, who's doing what, so that there are no gaps or therefore potential risks to the organization. A couple of years ago, I was involved in a healthcare device security webinar and session. And one of the things that came up that companies hadn't really put too much of a focus to was the underlying database and means by which the devices themselves operated and how vulnerable some might be because the platform that it was built on couldn't withstand the necessary upgrades from those areas that required it. So again, it needed to open the doors within the industry to ensure that you're not in a silo, that you're able to manage these and understand who's doing what. I'll leave it at those three bubbles.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, from a tech perspective, the things that our customers are asking right now in the field is about better access controls to protect them against data breaches. That's sort of what we are focused on in the short term, right? So that's the immediate need. As we have opened up these systems to more suppliers, more folks working from home, it's created an elevated risk, and unfortunately, for people to be able to do more with limited resources, you have to give them more access. Well, that creates additional problems. And so as more suppliers are getting into these databases, healthcare databases or supply chain databases, there's a higher risk of that data breach, right? So what we're seeing is that this is where some of the threats are coming from. The ransomware threat, the threat of even the insider threat. That's coming in from people having this elevated privilege access. So what we're trying to help our customers define better policies, maybe look at their access policies and update them for the new reality of elevated access. In fact, many of customers are taking on new digital platforms, such as Slack and others, to make it easier for their teams to collaborate remotely. Well, as part of that uptake on the digital transformation or digital adoption is that more data is getting exposed. So being able to prevent that right at the beginning of the provisioning process is very important to our customers, not after the fact. So customers want to be proactive in the healthcare industry and protect themselves from, compliance penalties that can be exorbitant given this environment. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we're seeing from our customer. I'd love to hear from a clinical perspective, Seth. I mean, what are some of your thoughts around the top risks that you're seeing here in the U.S.
Yeah.
as well as in UK?
Yeah, definitely. We're pretty fortunate that with our clinical security analytics platform, we've got a lot of interest from CISOs and CMIOs, Chief Medical Information Officers, because if you look on the slide, the three bubbles, at least to me, on the right, clinical risk, device management, and clinical workflow disruption have been of real interest. And the question being, how do we know what's on our network? How do we find out what it's doing with other things on our network? How is it behaving? Why is it behaving that way? Technically, but then what does it mean if that device starts behaving aberrantly? So let's say you have a CT scanner. If it's a CT scanner next to an emergency room, it's the only one. It runs 24/7. It's used to assess stroke patients and patients deteriorating from the medical wards or post-op, and that machine gets taken offline. What is the level of disruption, not just within that individual workflow, but the cascade of impact across the organization? Understanding that level of risk, it's very sophisticated, very complex, but those are the kind of questions we're answering with our analytics. And you can derive a lot of insight by looking at risk from that perspective. Sure, it sounds very clinical to begin with, and it is, the risk to patient care, but it cascades into finance, it cascades into regulatory, it cascades into reputational, all because of a vulnerability on one asset that you weren't necessarily aware of being exploited, all because someone somewhere else down the line clicked on a phishing email that gave someone access to get into the network to cause this harm. So that kind of viewpoint on risk and dealing with it, whether it's from a kind of audit and controls perspective, really GRC centric approach, or it's from a security operations center perspective, it's been a common theme that we've encountered from kind of leaders in the industry, especially in the US these days.
That's a good point, Seth. And just to kind of add to that is, the other pressure that as these devices are growing, and we're becoming more of I guess the IoT world. There are various projections about how everything we have, every device will have its own data feed. So I think as that's growing, the risk, as we can see, is emerging and growing. You outlined it very well. But as Chuck said earlier, I mean, the reduction in budgets or the scrutinization of budgets is there too, because as hospitals are, which is where I focus on primarily, and insurance companies and even pharmaceuticals. We're talking a number of pharmaceuticals. So what we're seeing from our pharmaceutical customers and hospitals and other clinics is that the budget's getting more scrutinized. Now there is budget for obviously getting COVID cure out as soon as possible, and the focus is obviously the right focus is to get handle this problem of the pandemic. But the budgets on IT side are constrained, right? And so I think that poses an interesting risk by itself, that while we are offering all of these capabilities to address the current pain points, that the budgeting cycles are actually tight. So the justification for getting these systems in, and more than justification, I think there's availability of resources and the bandwidth to get this technology in and up and running to improve the risk is a risk by itself, right? So we need to think about budgets too, and we're doing a lot of creative work around, being able to really tie specific pain points in an organization, diagnose those pain points, and then prescribe a solution, to borrow a few healthcare terms here, to really come to this, identity governance that I talked about earlier.
Well,
so fantastic input. Yeah.
I want to quickly just add to that. Even if you have the budget as an organization to invest in security, and you invest in kind of standard asset discovery solutions for device management, vulnerability scanners, one of the big issues is they create a lot of noise, and you risk, having this fatigue, or you end up with a list of tens of thousands of assets with tens of thousands of vulnerabilities, and you're still asking yourself the question, with your limited team size potentially, which one of these do I need to resolve first? Because you don't even have further clarity at that point. So I think, yeah, you raise a really good point, both about budgetary constraint, but also with the budget you do have, what you might procure might actually create more challenges than solutions. And that's why context is so important when looking at any of this data.
Excellent point. I think we've got that covered pretty well. Let's keep moving then.
Yes, so as you can see, one of the top threats on the previous slide was, HIPAA compliance. So let's talk a little bit about HIPAA compliance in the cybersecurity era. So we have a few talking points on the screen here. Chuck, if you'd like to give us some insight here. So should cybersecurity and compliance go hand in hand? Does HIPAA provide enough protection in today's environment? Should an organization, rely on HIPAA compliance to cover their security concerns? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Certainly an experience that I've had is again going back to that teamwork approach, and one where you start with the basics, and that is understanding and developing certain policies and procedures. And then what's even more critical is the training and education to ensure that staff in your organization know what to do, when to do it. Working with IT in security to ensure that appropriate encryption and tools that are there to sort of stop any leakage before it takes place. But again, I go back to the age-old, your biggest risk in many ways is within the personnel within your organization, and what you then do to ensure that they get it, from online tutorials that we had on a learning management system to those that are scanning the world in terms of regulation to ensure that you stay abreast of what you need to be doing and when to do it. So to think that just by providing and confirming that your HIPAA compliance is in play, that doesn't cover all the security concerns that are out there. And so, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think I'm exposed to a lot of regulatory work, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, but as a part of that, the regulatory agencies, both in the US and the European Union, there is notes comparisons. Everyone's always referencing whatever publications come from which organization first. And it's interesting, right? HIPAA captures so much of the mind share, but it's been around for a long time. And as a consequence of that, it's not out of the realms of possibility about updates of regulations or interpretations of regulations. You look at how, I often come across the question of, where does ransomware come in? When is ransomware a data breach versus when it isn't? And viewpoints, at least between lawyers working around HIPAA, you'd be surprised. You think it's cut and dry, but it really isn't. I suppose that's why we have lawyers. They can argue about these things. But it's interesting, interpretations of language. You've seen penalties around involving ransomware. If you start moving outside of HIPAA, you look at FDA guidance, advisory guidance around medical device security in the European Union. You see medical device regulations that are going to be enforced next year. They are delayed because of COVID effectively, which now have an entire chapter or document on security and clinical risk enmeshed together. You combine that with GDPR on this side, new e-privacy regulations. You look in the US, there's always the viewpoint now with how are different states going to define their regulations further, whether it comes to privacy or potential. I've heard and seen some conversations around defining critical infrastructure and penalties around state-level critical infrastructures. There are so many evolving patterns right now that I think, Chuck, exactly as you say, HIPAA is it's one piece on the chessboard, but it's by no means the only piece.
Right.
Yeah, I think you guys hit the nail on the head there. So clearly, HIPAA is not sufficient. It's really a bar that you must establish if you want to be in the business of healthcare. But it's you've got regulations coming from so many different directions, whether it's the state level or the national level, international level, as we have talked about here, that it's not sufficient. What I've seen actually emerge in the last few years, there was a CISO role that came many years ago, and now with this data becoming so important in all industries, specifically in healthcare, this role of a data protection officer that sort of was first, in my mind, outlined in the GDPR on the other side of the Atlantic. So I think that finally has the ability for companies to kind of put all the data under the guidance of someone that is accountable and responsible to control that data. And HIPAA sort of is part of that, data protection as well. But I don't see enough progress there to say that we have the mission accomplished, right? We're still sort of developing that here, especially on this side of the pond. I don't know as well how things are. I'd love to hear from Seth more about, how the maturity level you have seen in the last few years. But I think we're still early stages. So I think not having the people, process, and technology in place today really creates a opportunity for the cyber threat to be exposed and ultimately lead into reputational risk. So you've got to start putting together, that people, process, and technology in place. I think, Chuck, you made some really good points about training. I think it starts with having the leadership that understands, what our gaps are in the current knowledge base within the organization about how we treat data, and get beyond that, minimum checklist that you've got to do for HIPAA, because the fact that there are compliance issues and security issues that go beyond the minimal auditable requirements. And that's where the reputational risk comes in, back to that previous slide of all the different types of risks that healthcare is facing today. So I'd like to hear, the maturity level on what you see on your end, and maybe have Chuck comment a little bit on, in the state he lives in, because they have other protections to the people in that state.
I mean, yeah, Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck.
As Adil was mentioning, the state in which we operate, which is Massachusetts, clearly they keep us busy. And again, from a reputation standpoint, and as well as compliance, you have to do these things. And so making sure that the appropriate people within your organization are having that conversation, and the reality check of what makes sense to what can be done is at issue from time to time because of the mandate itself. But again, it goes back to, for many, what can be done on a day-to-day basis? How do you build it into daily life so it is part of the process, part of the culture of the organization, so that when a new twist comes at you, it isn't we got to start from scratch. It's more, how do we modify? So then we update the training, or do something to address that new need that's come to the eyes of the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, because from my perspective, at least, in the work we're doing, both in the US and particularly recently in the UK, to be precise, it's not just the maturity level at the healthcare organization level or at a regional level, it's also the maturity level we're seeing from the likes of medical device manufacturers and their viewpoints on regulations and their responsibilities. Very recently I was talking to a healthcare security leader I respect tremendously, a real pioneer, and he was saying to me how a medical device manufacturer didn't believe that their assets that they produce complied with certain regulations. And my viewpoint as an expert in that particular field was that, that clearly isn't the case. It does comply. When you have different levels of maturity in terms of your suppliers, as well as at the healthcare organization level, then it can be a really difficult web, to unweave, essentially, to figure out, well, what is the right answer? Who does need to comply with what? And if you're not quite mature at the healthcare organization level, but your suppliers have different levels of maturity, or different views of what they need to comply with, I mean, that's really challenging. So you need kind of solutions to help you just very directly tell you this is the correct answer, and therefore this is how you should plot a course. Easier said than done, of course.
Excellent point. So I guess to sum it up, I mean, I think tone at the top of an organization and the culture you build and the sustainability of that is more important than specific checklists. I mean, we have to comply and we have to protect our organization against cyber threats. But I think what I'm hearing is, to sum it up, is that that having that mindset as an organization is probably the most important thing you can do, and I think that comes from training and education, and like I said, tone at the top.
Yep, definitely. So how can we address this risk in the current environment which we're faced?
As the slide's showing here, to identify what are the risks, contextualize those, measure them, manage them. I think there are two areas that I certainly see that really drive the show is looking at defining your segregation of duty and restricted access controls, and really understand what a user can do. Many applications out of the box, you think, okay, it's limiting me to only do this. Well, the experiences I've had over my many years is that isn't necessarily true. And so you need to make sure that you understand what can be done. And therefore, it's a continuum, because software applications change. You've got new versions that the organization will need to move towards just to stay up to date with the investments that they've made. So, a combination of who's in and what they're able to do, but also once you look at your controls and you see that you've got certain settings that allow for certain behaviors, you've got to make sure that they remain in place, that there wasn't that intermittent change out, whether it's access to be able to input invoices or things of that nature, and put the setting back that the system then doesn't capture. You need to make sure that you've got the appropriate tools and capabilities to pull this out, because otherwise you're going to miss it. And I know certainly Saif and Adil can describe more so, but I think, again, if you were to narrow down to the top two that I was seeing that need your attention in moving things forward, again, is who's in and what are they doing, and the second is, if they're in, what are they changing, so that you don't have surprises.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, Chuck, you laid out the key pieces where you and I have collaborated in the past as well. So I think the first couple of things are more qualitative. I mean, executives and management is responsible to a large extent of identifying and contextualizing that risk. And from my experiences in this industry, 15 plus years, many of them know that intuitively, or they have a more formal process where they bring in third-party risk managers and go through that formal process. So it's a various level of a maturity model that we see in organizations. Like I said, some have a very formal process, others have it in people's head. They haven't gone through that level. But I think where it gets interesting, and this is where, Saif, I'd love to hear from you from a clinical perspective, is measuring, when it comes to measuring and managing. Here we say that you measure what you manage, right? So I think those are a couple of the key things. And of course, monitoring and reporting is sustainability of that. So I think this is a good slide to sort of put together a journey and maybe do a gut check or even a more formal check of where your organization, a healthcare organization, is today. But one of the areas where I think, Seth, I'm really intrigued working with you is, this analytics capability that you bring to the table that folks in the US and UK can apply to their healthcare organizations to really get that data-driven business decisions, more informed decisions.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Adil, and that's definitely the thing with us. The entire question we want to resolve, with our analytics, especially, should we say, at a device and a device behavioral level in an organization, it's all about that contextualize arrow there. Typically, today, security solutions, they just want to identify, this is X workstation or this is X diagnostic machine. Okay, let's look for vulnerabilities and assign a CVSS score. Let's rank it. Let's monitor it over time until we can apply some security controls. For us, that's never been good enough. For us, I want to know, what is the difference between workstation A and workstation B, even if they're in the same physical environment? What's the difference between CT scanner A and CT scanner B in terms of its critical utility to the organization, and what happens if it becomes aberrant? So for our analytics, it's all about, sure, detect the information, identify, but provide it to us so that we can run our algorithms to give you that nth degree of contextual insight. Because it's, as you say, you're going to generate quality data only if you have quality data coming in, but someone has to contextualize that. And by understanding the context, the clinical workflows, the operational workflows, the cascading effects, the measurement you ultimately get is something you can have much more trust in and faith in as the person who has to action it and be responsible for it moving forward. And so that's why we view ourselves, and what our platform does is something that runs under the covers. It's all about being part of a bigger suite that's doing the contextualization so that other solutions can then use that data to determine, okay, what actions should be guided, what controls should be guided, and how should we monitor and report on this over time. But that ultimate context is the bit that we're doing as a part of the puzzle.
Jana, we're really excited to working with you guys, Seth, and bring that capability to our clients here in the US, which is where primary business is, along with UK as well. But yeah, so I think if you are in assessing this journey or assessing your current state or reassessing it because of the current risk, as we've talked about today, take a look at, specifically around your measurement systems and your management and monitoring system, your reporting systems, because chances are, that's where you'll find gaps. Hopefully, customers we work with have really good risk management overall processes in place, but they're typically documented. But as we become more digital, it's no longer enough to document the process. It's very important, but it's not sufficient, right? So you have good documentation of what your risks are. Hopefully you're updating those already to include the current environment and the lessons we have learned in the last, let's say, 6 months, with this pandemic. So now is the time to maybe look at, go back in the market and look at, try out some of these things that Seth's talking about, because you'll be able to find, a more enriched information, both on the clinical side and, as Chuck said earlier, on the enterprise software side, right? Like segregation of duties. If you opened up your systems more, maybe you've opened up access to suppliers. So more people can now create suppliers and possibly pay suppliers, and that may be a risk. Maybe you're ordering items from a supplier that is on a vendor list that maybe you shouldn't be doing business with. So those are the kinds of things that analytics can help you, and we're really excited to work with Seth and of course with Chuck to provide this insight to you to help you evaluate your current position versus the future position you can have. With that, I'll move on to the next slide. I know we're running out of time, Emma. Go ahead.
Yes, okay, so how can your organization find the right solution for emerging risk? So again, we have some talking points there on the screen. So what is
So why don't I
your...
jump in on this one?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, Emma, go ahead.
It's fine. No, go ahead.
Just looking at my watch and I'm like, okay, let's gotta get through a couple of slides here to finish this off. So I'll jump in and be brief so you guys can add. But I'm excited about this question because we spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time personally looking at eye to eye and CIOs, and now with this, Zoom or whatever format we have. So I spend a lot of time answering this question every day with customers that are coming to us. And I think what they're typically starting out with is, look, we have a good understanding of what our risk is. We are not comfortable with certain risks that have occurred in this new environment. So what can you help us do? And they're testing us too. We're a supplier, right? So they want to know that we check the boxes for their supplier process, which is fantastic. We have our own SOC 1, SOC 2, we have a GDPR report. So we provide all those check boxes. And then it's down to those analytics and capabilities, right? Feature function battle, as you might call it. And that's where folks like Saf and Chuck, from his experience, vast experience in this U.S. healthcare market, are helping us. Where we are able to say, okay, based on those unique business needs you have, and the needs you have in these various silos of the organization, here's what the future may look like. So your day in the life of after you've put SafePass in, and you've got end-to-end controls. How can we reduce that budgetary cost that you're currently spending with external, service providers on really band-aiding the solution, so you can become more proactive. So I think that's where the business case comes in, and this is a fantastic question. I'd love to hear in the last few minutes from Chuck and Seth on how they go about, both from buyer and seller side, how do they go about looking at risk solutions? So maybe Chuck, since you are my customer, you might be able to answer that based on your experience with us and Oracle. Yeah.
One of the things that attracted the focus to Adil and your team was the ease at which you could use those tools and understand them and actually break through some of the technical hurdles of the underlying application software in how it was presented. I think, hands down, being able to have a business analyst be able to look at and provide those kinds of answers without having to write a service ticket to IT or someone else, or to bring things to the business where the business wasn't quite understanding what you meant by, or understanding what was at risk. Certainly focusing with your team and being able to get through the 2 points that I brought earlier in terms of the segregation of duty and really that fine grain analysis and keeping it current, I think of the keys.
Absolutely. Seth?
Yeah, from my perspective, and I say this as someone who's advised organizations, when it comes to vendor selection, but also I say it now as when we want to partner with other organizations. For me, what's always critical is I look at the leadership of an organization, if I just ignore the solution for a second, and have they walked the walk of what they're looking to present to me? If I'm partnering with an organization that's focusing on medical devices, does the leadership have a background in medical engineering, for example, in healthcare? You know that they've been there, done that. When I look at you, Adil, of course, with SafePass, you just have to look at your credentials. You wrote a book on on the subject. There's so much credentials there about walking the walk, and obviously, we're a testament to that ourselves, and that we're going to talk about clinical risk. But I've been there at 4 a.m., working in the equivalent of an emergency department, and the technology's failing all around me. So I think just having that credibility and real life experience is critical before I even get to the solution.
No, those are excellent points. Yeah, I think ultimately you're buying knowledge and experience, and you're trusting that. And I think it's hard to bottle that into a 2-minute segment. But yeah, this is where we can set up a specific workshop with you and have the expertise that you heard today on the call. So we're coming to an end. Emma, let's wrap it up in the next couple of minutes.
Yes, okay, so if Adil, you'd briefly like to talk about how, how technology can help in the last couple of slides in a minute or so, if possible.
Yeah, what I'll do is, in the effort of getting this wrapped up and giving folks time to go back, I'll just wrap it up on this slide and take it for more details on the last slide. So we're not here to advertise SafePass. We're here to really create the awareness and educate people on what experts like Seth and Chuck have to offer. So all I'm going to say is that once you make that decision about, moving forward with you have an interest and you want to move forward with that, seeing what's new in the market, because we all have some sort of risk management today. That's why you're here. You're going to find that fine-grained access is one of the key ways to prevent risk from coming into your organization, whether it's a mandate like HIPAA or an emerging opportunity in your organization because of COVID-19 pandemic, and then monitoring the heck out of it, right? So we heard different ways. We talked about the approach and the risks, but ultimately what we think is, if you can monitor and manage your risks in their processes, you will be able to make the right decisions and ultimately be able to get to that, holy grail of analytics, which is predictive analytics, right? So if we can build a pattern, apply some stats to it with collecting the data, and then be able to avoid those future outcomes that can elevate the risk, we're all better off. So that's where the technology comes in. We're super excited about what AI and machine learning is doing for our customers today, and we'd love to help you see our latest and greatest that our tech teams are putting together, and bring folks like the panelists today to help you really validate that for your specific business. So with that, I'm just going to take it to the last slide and have Abid, Seth, and from Abid Graham Group and Chuck kind of give us some closing comments. And thank you guys for your participation. Excellent insight.
Thanks, Adil.
Certainly, I think the opportunity to talk today over the experiences I've had in this, that hopefully it triggers a thought for you to pursue or know what channel to bring your questions to. So thanks again for everyone.
Yeah, and so thank you for having me on the panel. Certainly, we're doing some very exciting work, especially around IoT and clinical risk and analytics. You can feel free to email me or visit our website. And of course, hopefully, more news will come out in the future about the work we're doing with SafePass. So a lot of exciting things to stay tuned for. So thanks, Adil and Emma, Absolutely. For having me on the panel.
You're quite welcome. Yes, thanks to everyone for joining our session today, and a big thank you to all of you for joining us. All attendees will receive the recording and a follow-up email. And please feel free to reach out to me if you would like a copy of our slide deck today. And feel free, and we can set up a call for a deeper dive if you'd like to learn more. So yes, thank you, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.